Well, then it's time for us to get started, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you Floris Roelofsen, who is an associate professor at the Institute for Logic, Language and Computation at the University of Amsterdam, which is also where he got his PhD. During his PhD, he got anaphora resolved under the direction of Jeroen Groenendijk. And he has since worked on an immense wealth of topics within linguistics, but focusing on overarching questions, which I think make his work an amazing research project in linguistics and logic and computation. And his main questions at this point are how to capture meaning beyond truth conditions, specifically focusing on the fact that alternatives play a huge role, how to get them into a formal framework, how to get a logic for them, and how to get a computational semantics for this. And this is what drives the work in the framework of Inquisitive Semantics that Floris is one of the main proponents of, one of the main driving forces behind. And well, the very fact that this has its own name as a framework is rather rare these days in linguistics and maybe also logic and linguistics. So I'm very excited about this and having him here. We should also mention that he has a second research focus these days, which is sign language, and specifically also computational tools making sign language also accessible. They have a very brand new COVID-19 grant project where they work on how to help healthcare providers communicate with deaf patients by translating between Dutch and the sign language of the Netherlands. So this is rather diverse probably from the work he's showing us today, but it gives you an idea of just how broad his profile is and how much contribution he is making and has been making. And it's also worth mentioning that he has not just been at the ILLC, but he has also held visiting appointments at Stanford, at UC Santa Cruz, at Harvard, and is giving a lot of talks. So we are very happy that he found the time to come here and talk to us today. And with that, I would like to cede the floor to Floris. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to share my screen. All right, thanks for having me and thanks for the very kind introduction. I'm going to present joint and ongoing work with Jakub Dotlacil today, who is also in our meeting. And it's on referential indeterminacy and questions, dynamic inquisitive semantics. But I'll start by framing the questions that we're going to look at in a somewhat more general setting. Oops, can I? Yes. And I'll start with the question, what makes the life of a formal semanticist so difficult and yet so interesting? And one of the answers to this is those bloody alternatives, which are everywhere. And a formal model of linguistic interpretation needs to keep track of them. What do I have in mind? Well, so let's look at a simple example without alternatives first. So Peter smiled. So there's a referential expression referring to a certain individual, a predicate expressing a certain property. The statement conveys the information that the individual referred to by Peter has the property expressed by smiled. And in uttering the sentence, speaker proposes to add this piece of information to the conversational common ground, the information that participants have so far agreed upon. And that's a very neat basic picture. But when we look beyond cases like these, things become more complex in many different directions. And these complexities are often due to the fact that linguistic expressions give rise to various kinds of alternatives. So for instance, a man smiled involves a certain kind of indeterminacy. So there's not a man doesn't refer to a particular individual, but rather introduces a set of referential alternatives, or at least this is one way to think about indefinite expressions. The question, who smiled? In this case, a speaker doesn't propose to add a specific piece of information to the common ground, but asks the addressee to pick from one of various alternatives. Then with focus, Peter always smiled, or Peter always smiled. We have that focus marking evokes alternatives, which in turn affect the interpretation of expressions associating with these focus alternatives. With scalar items, like some guests smiled, we have alternatives like many and all coming into play, and typically giving rise to inferences of exhaustivity. And so we have, and this is not even an exhaustive list, we have many types of alternatives, and this is broadly recognized as a very important aspect of semantics, and it has received much attention in the literature. But most of the work is concentrated on one type of alternative at a time. And what I think is very interesting as a general research question is how do these alternatives, these different types of alternatives interact with each other? And so today's talk is a particular case study, as it were, within this general line of research. And today I'm going to focus on the first two types of alternatives, one's having to do with referential indeterminacy and one's having to do with questions. Concretely, that brings, so the investigation of how these two phenomena interact brings us also to, well, we will investigate this by looking at two particular semantic frameworks, dynamic semantics, which has been designed to capture referential indeterminacy, among other things, but very centrally to capture referential indeterminacy, and inquisitive semantics, which has been designed to capture alternatives introduced by questions. And so the question is also, how do these lines of work interact? How can they be brought together in a fruitful way? And as I said, this is joint work, ongoing work with Jakub. And we have some initial building blocks in place in some that we've presented at Zinnenbedeutung and Salt over the last 2 years, but really developing a full-blown compositional system that brings these two lines of work together is quite a challenge. But also, I think there are many opportunities that arise, and I'll mention some of those along the way today. So I will focus today on a selection of motivating empirical phenomena for integrating a dynamic and inquisitive perspective on semantics, and then lay out a rudimentary framework, dynamic inquisitive semantics framework. And, well, at least give an impression of how the motivating phenomena could be accounted for naturally in that framework. So as for the motivating phenomena, I'll split it up into two. So first I'll talk about phenomena motivating a dynamic semantics for questions. And then once we have, well, motivation to go dynamic in dealing with questions, there's some further motivation, although I won't dwell too much on that, for adopting an inquisitive, in particular, acquisitive versus partition semantics. So the two phenomena that I will highlight are anaphora. So dynamic semantics of questions is needed to capture certain types of anaphora. And a second is that it is an attractive account, at least of certain kinds of intervention effects. So as you know, dynamic semantics has been motivated by contrasts like those illustrated in 7 and 8. So if you say one of my 10 marbles is not here, you can continue with it is probably under the sofa. So it can pick up this missing marble. But if you say the truth conditionally equivalent sentence, 9 of my 10 marbles are here, then you can't continue with it is probably under the sofa. So 7a and 8a are truth conditionally equivalent, but they behave differently in discourse. They, well, 7a licenses an anaphoric expression here that 8a doesn't license. And in dynamic semantics, this is captured by assuming that beyond truth conditional content, sentences generally have, or what's characteristic more generally for this, for the meaning of for the semantic content of a sentence is its context change potential, and that includes the potential to introduce discourse reference, which can serve as antecedents for subsequent anaphoric expressions. Now, similar examples can be constructed with questions. So we can ask, which one of her 3 sons inherited the house? And then we can continue, and is he going to live there? Where he refers back to whichever of the 3 sons that inherited the house. So the WH phrase sets up an antecedent for the pronoun. But in 10, which 2 of her 3 sons did not inherit the house? And is he going to live there? That doesn't work. So the observation is parallel to what we saw before. The initial questions in 9 and 10 are equivalent in terms of resolution conditions, but they set up different antecedents for subsequent anaphora. And that requires a dynamic treatment of questions, a theory of questions that captures not only resolution conditions, but also, at the very least, the potential of questions, and in particular WH phrases, to set up antecedents for subsequent anaphora. The other phenomenon is intervention effect. So certain operators, when occurring in between a WH phrase and an interrogative complementizer, lead to so-called intervention effects. So here is a famous example from Sigrid Beck's work in German. So, wer hat Luise wo angetroffen? Who met Louise where? That is a multiple WH question. So, wer, the who is fronted, but wo, meaning where, is in situ. And this is fine. This is just interpreted as a multiple WH question. But then when we replace the referential expression Louise with a negative quantifier, nobody, niemandem, then all of a sudden this multiple WH interpretation becomes highly degraded, unavailable. So the interpretation would be who did nobody, well, so the interpretation that we would want is who didn't meet anybody where, but that doesn't work. But if you change the word order, so if wer hat wo niemandem angetroffen is considered, then that interpretation does become available. So it's really the intervention of this negative quantifier between the in situ WH element and the left periphery, what has been argued to cause the intervention effect. And there's a range of different operators that can produce such effects, focus-sensitive operators like only, even, nominal quantifiers like every, no, most, few, adverbial quantifiers, negation. And there's various ways that people have proposed we could understand these effects. And they center on how should we understand the relation between the WH phrase and the associated complementizer or operator in the left periphery? So two prominent approaches, there are others as well, but two prominent ones are Siegel-Beck's approach based on focus, which assumes that WH words introduce focus alternatives, and this interrogative complementizer has to access those alternatives. So if if the complementizer cannot access the focus alternatives because they are consumed by this intervening operator, then intervention effects arise. Another approach is Haida's. So this is a dynamic approach, which assumes that WH words introduce discourse reference that the interrogative complementizer has to access. And the intervention effects arise if the access to those discourse reference is blocked by operators, intervening operators that don't let discourse reference project from out of their scope. So these two approaches have complementary pros and cons, or scope, if you want, empirical scope. The focus approach works well for focus-sensitive interveners like only and even, but nominal quantifiers, for instance, are, as Beck already discusses herself, are not directly within the scope of this account because they're not necessarily focus-sensitive. So they don't necessarily consume the focus alternatives that are introduced within their scope. And also, so there's some experimental data that suggests that that not all focus-sensitive particles are actually interveners. So there are open issues there. The dynamic approach, on the other hand, works well for operators that have been argued independently, certain quantifiers, negation, that have been argued independently to block access to discourse reference that are introduced within their scope. So you can say Jane bought a car, it was black, but then if the indefinite that introduces the antecedent is within the scope of a negation, Jane didn't buy a car, it was black, that doesn't work. Or most students bought a car, it was black. Or Jane has often bought a car, it was black. So leaving aside the configuration where the indefinite takes wide scope over these operators, of course, that does work. But if it's interpreted as taking scope within under negation or most or often, then these anaphoric relations don't work. And that's exactly what that makes it very natural to assume that in the case of intervention effects, something similar is going on, at least intervention effects involving these operators. On the other hand, so on this approach, focus-sensitive particles like only and even, they don't block discourse reference from projecting. So they definitely require a different explanation, as for instance, Haida notes and pursues in his dissertation. And I'd say that there's one big issue for both approaches, which is that there's cross-linguistic variation as to which operators act as interveners. And that's puzzling for both approaches. And to a large extent, it remains an issue that needs to be investigated more. So we have seen then some motivation for pursuing a dynamic semantics of questions, anaphora and intervention effects. There are some more that we might be able to touch upon later, but I'll start from these two. Now, so if we want a dynamic theory, there's work already pursuing such a dynamic approach to questions, but these are all based on partition semantics. So they take partition semantics of questions as a starting point and dynamicize that. So there's the work I mentioned here by Groenendijk, Van Rooij, and Haida in particular. But partition semantics has a well-known limitation, So it's designed and able to capture exhaustive interpretations of questions like which of the guests are vegetarian, where you want an exhaustive specification of the vegetarian guests. But as is well known, so non-exhaustive interpretations are more difficult to derive on a partition semantics. For instance, a question like, what is a typical French dish, where you're just looking for one or a couple of examples, and that would fully resolve the issue. Those are more difficult to derive in partition semantics. And inquisitive semantics, in part, I mean, there's lots more motivation behind inquisitive semantics, but in part, and when seen specifically in comparison with partition semantics, it's designed in such a way that both exhaustive and non-exhaustive, as well as readings in between exhaustive and non-exhaustive, can be captured in a natural way and straightforward way. Another limitation of partition semantics is that it can't really deal with disjunctions of questions. So for instance, in 15, we have, where can I rent a bike, or who has one that I could borrow? While there are, there's a very interesting literature on the fact that it's not always possible to disjoin two questions. So there are perfectly natural instances of disjunctions of two questions, such as 15. And these are problematic because the union of two partitions, which are formally encoded as equivalence relations, generally does not yield another partition. Whereas in inquisitive semantics, disjunctions of questions can be handled straightforwardly on a par with conjunctions, and also on a par with disjunctions of statements. So while there's more to say, here's an overview of what I have said so far. Static inquisitive semantics cannot deal with anaphora with WH antecedents, can't deal with intervention effects, but it has a straightforward way of dealing with non-exhaustive interpretations of questions and disjunctions of questions. Dynamic theories that have been developed so far are based on partition semantics. They can deal with anaphora and with intervention effects, but not with the other two phenomena. And so we're looking at to integrate these two lines of work to, at the very least, obtain a framework in which we can naturally deal with these four phenomena, and hopefully with more. All right, so here's an outline of how such a framework could look like. I'll present a system that we call INC-D, which combines ideas from or notions from the INC-B, so that's the basic static inquisitive framework, as well as ideas from the dynamic semantics of Groendak et al. 96, and the compositional dynamic system of Muskin's 96. There are many other instantiations of dynamic semantics. Here we build mostly on these, but as far as we can tell, the broad ideas could be applied to other instantiations of dynamic semantics as well. However, we also limit ourselves here to, to keep things manageable and also more transparent. So for instance, we don't include a theory of numbers, so of plurals. And in fact, we think including a theory of plurals, incorporating a theory of plurals, which has been developed in great detail in the dynamic semantic literature, has a lot to give us actually in the semantics of questions. But this is not today. And let me start then with the central notion, which is the notion of context. So in dynamic semantics, meanings are context change potentials. And so if we want to set up a dynamic inquisitive semantics, we need to think about contexts, what those are, and then we can think about how those can change and how utterances can change them. But first, context. So let's look at contexts in GSV. So this is Groenendijk-Sokol-Feldman 96. These contexts are designed to represent two kinds of information: information about the world, information about the discourse reference, and then also information about dependencies between the world and possible values of the discourse reference. So if the world is such, then the possible values of my discourse reference are such and such. If the world is such, then the possible values might be different. So formally, a context is a set of possibilities where each possibility is a pair, WG, where W is a world and G an assignment function. So an assignment of values to the discourse reference. And indeed, this encodes information about the world. So if we look at the world projections at the first element of each pair in the context S, then we have the set of all worlds that is compatible with the information about the world that we so far have accumulated in the context. Information about the discourse reference, because we can look at all these assignments, G, and we know then that gives us a way of representing the information that has been established so far about what the values of the discourse reference might be. And also information about dependencies between what the world is like and what the values of the discourse reference could be like. Okay. But okay, obvious limitation for our purposes is that these contexts formalized in this way represent information, but not issues. So we can't dream to capture the update effect of a question here, because presumably a question raises a new issue in the context. So if we want to capture their effect on the context, we have to start with a notion of contexts that captures the issues that have been raised so far. Okay, so here we turn to inquisitive semantics, which does exactly that. So inquisitive semantics, so basic static inquisitive semantics, offers a notion of context, which represents information about the world and also issues raised about the world. Formally, a context in basic inquisitive semantics is a set of information states, where each information state is a set of possible worlds, where each information state in the context C is such that it contains enough information to resolve the raised issues, and no information state in C contains any worlds that have been ruled out by the already established information. So if we're in a context where we know that John is coming and we wonder, the issue has been raised whether Mary is coming, then our context consists of information states in which we know what we already know, that John is coming, as well as some resolution to the question that has been raised, so that either that Mary is coming or that Mary is not coming. Contexts in inquisitive semantics are downward closed, and that follows from this general idea. So if a context contains a certain information state S, and T is contains more information than S, so it's a subset of S, then T is also contained in the context, because so for instance, in our context where we know that John is coming and we want to know that whether Mary is coming, an information state in which we also know that it's raining outside, for instance, as well as that John is coming and that Mary is coming, that's also in our context as an information state in which our issues would be resolved. So that's one formal property of context. Then the information available in a context is always captured by the union of all these states in that context, and that's referred to as info C, the information available in the context. And then we can say that the context is inquisitive just in case the info C, so the information that is available, is not an element of C. So for instance, if we want to know whether Mary is coming, we know that John is coming, we want to know whether Mary is coming, then the set of all worlds whether John is coming is our info, but it's not an element of C because it's not a state in which we have resolved our issues. And so this is an inquisitive context. We are entertaining the issue and they haven't resolved yet whether Mary is coming. Okay, so here's another limit, a different limitation, obviously. Contexts represent information and issues about the world, but not about the values of the discourse reference, let alone dependencies between what the world might be like and what the values of the discourse reference are like. Okay, so our first task then is to bring these two together, these two notions of context together in a natural way. And there is a natural way. So we can say that a context C is a downward closed set of information states, just like in inquisitive semantics. But now information states are not just sets of worlds, but sets of possibilities, world assignment pairs, as in dynamic semantics. So as in inquisitive semantics, we assume that each information state in a context contains enough information to resolve the contextual issues, and no information state in a context contains any possibilities that have already been ruled out by the contextually established information. Now, this is a way of depicting a context. So here we have worlds, a world where where I say Anne is singing. Here A and B are both singing. Here B is singing, and here neither of the two is singing. Here are assignment functions. So here's an assignment function where A is assigned to the discourse referent U, and here's an assignment function where B is assigned to U. And so these dots are all possibilities. So pairs of a world and an assignment function. A set of those possibilities is an information state. So this area here is an information state where in this information state, we have the information that either A or B is singing. And we don't have any information about what the value of U is. Could be either A or B. And now a context is a set of information states, but it's downward closed. So this, for instance, could be a picture of a context. It's the whole information state and then downward closed. But to avoid these kinds of pictures, we're going to just depict the maximal elements. So this is a representation of a context. And so this is understood as a set of information states, a downward closed set of information states. And I'm only depicting the maximal element. All right, so, well, one thing that is special about this context is that it's not inquisitive. There's only one maximal element, which corresponds to the info of C, and that's an element of C. Here we have two inquisitive contexts. So here on the left, there are two maximal elements in the context, each representing one way of resolving the issue that is present in the context. So what we have here is an issue about the value of the discourse reference. Is it A or is it B? And no information is required about the world. Whereas here on the right, we have an issue about what the world is like. Is only Anne singing, or only Bill, or Anne and Bill both? Right, so we can represent issues about the world or issues about the discourse reference. And here we have an issue which whose resolution requires some information about the world, but it's not a partition. So the two maximal elements overlap. So if we receive the information that Anne is singing, that's enough to resolve the issue. We don't need to know about Bill. If we receive the information that Bill is singing, that's also enough. So this is more of a mention sum issue, whereas here we have a partition and we really need to know, is it only Anne, only Bill, or both? All right, so now there are some notions that I will briefly introduce and that we'll need later in the semantics. I won't spell this out in full detail. I think you'll get an idea of what these means, and that's enough for today, for the talk. So we can say that a state, S prime, extends another state, just in case it contains more information about the world, so fewer possibilities, and or it contains more information about discourse reference. So either it has more discourse reference, or it allows for, it leaves open fewer possibilities as to what the values could be of the discourse reference. So that's extension. Then subsists. So a state subsists in another state if that other state is an extension of the original state, but no new information about the world is added. So and also no new information about the discourse reference that were already introduced is added. So every possibility in S is still in S prime modulo the addition of new discourse reference. So we've only introduced, if anything at all, new discourse reference and information about them, but otherwise, so this is called subsistence. Oops, and a state consists in a context if it subsists in some state in that context. And we then say that the state that it subsists in is a descendant of the original state. All right. Okay, so now we're going to build up the logical language and give its interpretation. We assume 4 basic types: E for individuals, S for possible worlds, T for truth values. So these are standard. And then also a basic type R for discourse reference. And using these basic types, we can form more complex types. And here are a couple of frequently used types. So for instance, here we have the type RE, which is a mapping from discourse reference to individuals. So that's the type of a discourse referent assignment function. We have the type of the type of a pair consisting of a world and an assignment function. So that is the type of a possibility, world assignment pair. We have information states, which are sets of possibilities. We have contexts, which are sets of information states. So I is an abbreviation of this type for information states. And we have update functions, which are functions from context to context, where K is an abbreviation of this type. So these are the main kinds of objects that we'll be talking about. Now, I'll present the semantics by going through its clauses. And in each case, I'll focus on giving some examples so that you see what it amounts to. So here's the clause for a basic predicate combined with a discourse referent. So I read this as U has the property R. So this denotes a context update. It takes a context, and then it gives us a set of states. So that's a new context. where these states are part of the old contexts, and every possibility in the state is such that in the world element of that possibility, the individual assigned to you by the assignment part of the possibility has the property R. So for instance, if this is our initial context, then if we say you sings, that brings us here, because in this possibility, A, which is assigned to you, sings in WA. Here, A sings as well. Here we have to look at B, because B is assigned to you, and we see that B sings, and here also B sings. So these are the possibilities that we're left with. In fact, so we're not actually ruling out possibilities, but we're getting rid of information states consisting of possibilities. Here's conjunction. So it's sequential update. These are two update functions. We take a context, we first apply A, and then we apply B. So that's standard in dynamic semantics. Now, what about introducing a discourse reference? So let's look at an example. So this is what you would expect. It is, I think. So if we start with this context, where we have a set of worlds, we don't have any discourse reference introduced yet. And then a discourse reference U is introduced. So then we take these possibilities in the old context, and we create copies of those possibilities, each with a different value for U. So that gives us this context, and then we can update with something like U sings, giving the context that the update that we've seen before. Disjunction. So what we assume here is a treatment of disjunction that is similar to its treatment is in basic inquisitive semantics. So we take a context, we update it with the first disjunct, and we update it also with the second disjunct, and then we take the union of the two output contexts. So for instance, this is a context in which we're talking about just one individual, Anne, say, and here's a world where Anne sings, here's a world where she sings and dances, here's a world where she just dances, and here's a world where she doesn't do anything. Now, here's the update with, yeah, think of this as, well, someone sings or someone dances. Yeah, we haven't talked about the mapping yet from English sentences to their logic, but it's good to have this intuition in the background. So here, the first disjunct introduces this discourse reference and restricts the context to cases where the value assigned to that discourse reference sings. So that's this part. The second disjunct generates this other part, and then we take the union of the two output contexts, and we get to this inquisitive context. Here is an update with someone sings or no one sings. And so here we get the first part gives us this maximal element, this context. Nobody sings gives us this context, which doesn't involve any discourse reference. And then the union of the two is depicted here. And so the possibilities in this context differ with respect to with respect to the domain of discourse reference. So that's allowed. And that's interesting so empirically speaking, that's interesting for contrasts observed by Stone a long time ago. So for instance, Bill either rented a blue car or a red car. It was probably a cabrio. That's fine. But Bill either rented a car or hitchhiked. It was probably a cabrio. That's not good. So Bill either rented a blue car or a red car, that corresponds to this type of context where all possibilities in the output context have a discourse referent in their domain. And so that can be picked up by, that can be referred back to by a pronoun. But Bill either rented a car or hitchhiked. In that case, the output context consists of possibilities that do have a discourse referent and ones that don't. In addition, so if we have Bill either rented a car or he hitchhiked, and then somebody else says, yeah, the former, of course, and it was a cabrio, that's fine because after A's utterance, we have a context which is not uniform with respect to the domain of discourse reference. But then if B says the former, of course, then we restrict to the context in which every possibility does have a discourse referent, and then we can pick that up. Same in 22, did Bill rent a car or did he hitchhike? The former, it was a cabrio. So yeah, that's possible. Now, negation. So negation is treated similar to static inquisitive semantics, but also dynamic semantics, in that, negation blocks inquisitiveness as well as discourse reference that are introduced within its scope. So it's defined in terms of subsistence. Let's just look at some examples to see how it works. So we start with this context here. We have two discourse reference and 4 worlds. Then we say U1 doesn't sing. That brings us to this context because U1 is A, and here A doesn't sing. If we say U1, it's not the case that U1 or U2 sings. That brings us here. And we see that whereas this disjunction is inquisitive, if we negate that, we don't see that inquisitiveness anymore. And we will never, if a negation will never yield something inquisitive. Here we have, it's a double negation of U1 or U2 sings. And there we get this context where we now know that U1 or U2 sings, but there's no issue. So even with double negation, the inquisitiveness of the disjunction is blocked or is filtered out. Then we can define another operator that blocks inquisitiveness, as in basic inquisitive semantics. So we denote it as the, well, we first define the exclamation mark of C, or the non-inquisitive closure of C, is the set of states that are contained in the informative content of C. And then the non-inquisitive projection of an update function, exclamation mark A, is essentially, we do the update with A here. Then we take the non-inquisitive closure of the resulting context. And then we also require that the context in the output context are extensions of states in the initial context. What does that amount to? That amounts to an operation that kills inquisitiveness. So here is an update with a disjunction that results in an inquisitive A or B. So U1 sings or U2 sings context. If we apply this non-inquisitive closure, we get a context that has the same informational content, but no inquisitiveness. So that's similar to double negation, but it's dissimilar from double negation in that it only blocks inquisitiveness, not discourse reference, not access to discourse reference. So here is an update with a discourse referent introduction operator. So we start without discourse reference, then we have a discourse referent. And if we update with exclamation mark of that say someone sings, then we keep our discourse reference and discourse information. Whereas with double negation, that is also gone. Okay. Now, an operator that is of particular interest for semantics of questions. So this is a polar question operator, say, which is the inquisitive disjunction of the update itself and its negation. So for instance, in this initial context, if we ask, does U1 sing? We get this output context where in this is a state in which it's known that U1 sings, U1 is A, and this is a state in which we know that A doesn't sing. And there's a variant of this operation, which we call a conditional question mark or conditional polar question operator. And the idea is that this operator ensures inquisitiveness in a conservative way. So if A itself is not inquisitive, then it applies question mark. But if A is already inquisitive, then it leaves A alone. So it ensures inquisitiveness in a most conservative way. We'll use that in our semantics of of English. And here, I think this is the final bit. This is also a crucial operator for a semantics of questions. We call this a witness request operator. So an operator that asks for the establishment of to fix the value of a certain discourse referent, U. So question mark, U, think of it as, what is the value of U? So we take a context and output a new context consisting of states S, which are in the initial context, and which are such that there is a specific individual, specific entity, X, such that for every possibility in the state S, X is the value of U in that possibility. Right? So in the output context of what is U, we only have states that agree on a specific value for U. This is what I call version 1 here. Okay, first an example. So here we have an input context where we don't know what the value of U is. And also there's no issue here. So in this context, we don't want to know what the value of U is, or that issue hasn't been raised. And then this issue is raised by question mark U. And now these two are split. And this is a state in which we know that the value of U is A. And this is a state in which we know that the value of U is B. So this raises an issue about the value of a discourse referent. This is version 1. Then there is a version 2, which is ultimately, we think, more appropriate, but also a bit more complicated. I'm happy to return to it later. What you see here in the picture is that it allows for overlap. And so it doesn't necessarily split things into a partitional issue. Now, one more thing is that we can also ask for what we call functional witnesses. So if we have a sequence of discourse reference, say we have 2. So for a multiple WH question, like who ate what, we have 2 discourse reference, and we want to raise the issue whose resolution requires specifying a function from the possible values for that first discourse reference to the possible values of the second discourse reference. So the resolution has to establish a certain dependency between the 2 discourse reference. So that's what is done here. So the question mark U1, say U1, U2, and this is generalized here, takes a context and gives us a new context, which is a set of states S, which are an element of the initial context and which are such that there is a function F, such that for all possibilities in S, the value of U2, say, in P is the function F applied to the value of U1 in P. Or if there are more discourse reference, we have more here. So that is what we call a functional witness request operator. And that will be important in our treatment of multiple WH questions. Okay, so let's see how this can apply in a simple syntax semantics interface for English questions. So we assume here that a question like who left has two projections in the left periphery, following Rizzi, for instance. There's a focus projection and there's a sentence type projection. And so we assume that who is just like someone. So we disregard here the restriction to animate values. So we just say this introduces well, it combines with a property, and it introduces a discourse referent U, and then there's an update that U has the property P that it combines with. And then this focus head associates with, can associate at least with WH elements in its scope. So that's encoded here by this subscript U. So this focus head associates in this structure with this WH element. And what it does is, so it takes an update function that is expressed by the TP. It carries out the update A, but with non-inquisitive closure. So the idea is that each TP results in a non-inquisitive update. Any inquisitiveness that is introduced below TP is cancelled, doesn't surface, say. And then it requests a witness for U. That's the second update. Okay, so for instance, this structure, a focus head who left, what it comes down to is it introduces a discourse referent. It says that discourse referent, whoever it was, left, and then it asks, who was it? Who was this, the person that left? Okay. So note that who in itself is not inquisitive. It's just like an indefinite. It becomes, its inquisitive thrust comes through the association with the focus head. But the inquisitiveness is only introduced by the focus head. We haven't said yet what the type head does. So we assume that, simplifying somewhat, because there's also something to be said about presuppositions, but we don't do that here. So the type head expresses this conditional question mark, or ensuring inquisitiveness. The idea is that essentially the interrogative type head ensures inquisitiveness. The declarative type head does something different, but the interrogative type head ensures inquisitiveness. Well, this is vacuous in WH questions because the FOC head will already introduce inquisitiveness, and then this operator will be vacuous. But in polar questions, it's crucial. So in who left, there nothing happens, but did someone leave? This operator comes into play, and it generates a polar question reading. So with two alternatives in the two maximal elements in the output context. Okay, now this FOC head can also associate with multiple WH elements in like who, so, what. And then it does what it always, so it takes a discourse context update. It carries that out with non-inquisitive closure. And then it raises the issue whose resolution requires establishing a functional dependency between the values of U1 and U2. So who, so, what, there, who introduces the discourse referent, what introduces the discourse referent. Then we update with the information that U1 saw U2. And then we raise the issue. What's the dependency between the values for who and the values for what? Okay, so now for declaratives. So here's a declarative with an indefinite. Someone left. Someone is treated just like a WH element. Introduce a discourse referent and then results in an update saying that that discourse referent has the property that it combines with. And the focus head is also the same as in interrogative. So the focus head is not clause type specific. It's always the same. The only thing that differs is that it can associate with either 0 or 1 or 2 or multiple WH elements. Here in a declarative, there are no WH elements, so it doesn't associate with any WH elements, and it only carries out the context update expressed by the TP with non-inquisitive closure. So what we get for someone left is this, introducing a discourse referent U and the update that U left. We have, sorry, this. Okay, now let's return to the phenomena that we started with. So first, anaphora. There are declarative cases, like someone arrived, he is wearing glasses. So these are already dealt with in standard dynamic systems. Someone introduces a discourse referent, then we update with the information that you arrived, and then the second sentence, the pronoun picks up the discourse referent, and we add the information that that discourse referent you is wearing glasses. Now we can do the same for questions. So who arrived? Is he wearing glasses? So WH element introduces a discourse referent. We add the information that that discourse referent, whoever it is, arrived. We ask who it is. And then we add a polar question whether that discourse the value of that discourse referent, whoever it is wearing glasses. So WH word introduces discourse referent just like an indefinite. The focus head is the operator that's responsible for inquisitiveness. So that requests a witness for the discourse referent. But that doesn't interfere at all with binding with anaphora. So the discourse referent that the WH word introduced is still there, and it can be picked up by pronouns in subsequent sentences or also in the same structure. One thing we can deal with in this way is donkey anaphora involving questions. So for instance, if a farmer owns a donkey, does he beat it? With a treatment of a natural treatment of implication, which I haven't mentioned yet, and I won't go into detail. So this is very similar to the Groendijk, Stockholm, Feldman treatment of implication. We can treat this as so a conditional, where in the antecedent, two discourse referents are introduced for the farmer and the donkey. The first is a farmer, the second a donkey. The first owns the second. And then in the consequent, the polar issue is raised whether the first beats the second. And so such cases are beyond the reach of existing dynamic theories of questions because conditional questions are difficult for partition semantics, and partition semantics forms the basis for these existing approaches. Okay, so now intervention effects. Here's a baseline case of a grammatical example. Wer hat Louise wo angetroffen? So this is who met Louise where. So two discourse references are introduced for who and where. We update with the information that U1 met Louise at location U2. And then we ask for a functional witness, so a dependency from people that met Louise and places where the meeting took place. And now what goes wrong with interveners like nobody is that in this case, who met nobody where, what happens is that this discourse reference associated with or contributed by where is introduced within the scope of a negative operator. So we render this as a negation scoping over an indefinite. So we treat this as a negative indefinite. And that means that this discourse referent is not available outside the scope, is not accessible outside of the scope of this negation. In particular, it's not accessible by the witness request operator that sits here. So that's why, a question interpretation is doesn't come out in parallel with the fact that discourse reference under negative operators are not accessible for later anaphoric elements. Let me look at the time because I don't, here's a point where I could, I should definitely skip. So there's some further observations to make. Maybe I want to highlight this one. So non-exhaustive readings are straightforwardly captured in this setting. So who has a bike that I could borrow for 50 minutes? So I mentioned some question. Is analyzed as leading to this type of output context with overlapping alternatives. One alternative for like Mary has a bike, or sorry, Anne has a bike that you could borrow. And the other alternative for Bill has a bike. And these are mutually compatible. But how to derive exhaustive reading? Because this is the base, what we derive with the setup that I've given so far. How to derive exhaustive readings. I think this is a very interesting part, a kind of an opportunity that arose that we hadn't actually anticipated beforehand. Interestingly, so exhaustive and non-exhaustive question readings arise very naturally from strong versus weak interpretations of indefinites. And these have been proposed independently to account for strong and weak readings of donkey and afra. So strong reading of donkey and afra is most prominent in cases like 50. If a farmer owns a donkey, he beats it. Where this is about, so this says, whenever a farmer owns one or multiple donkeys, the farmer beats all the donkeys. But there's a weak reading, which is salient in cases like 51. If Bill has a dime, he puts it in the parking meter, where the salient interpretation is that if Bill has one or multiple dimes, he puts one of his dimes, or maybe two, but not necessarily all of them, into the parking meter. Now, this has been a central topic in dynamic semantics, many different proposals. Adrian Brascoviano has a particularly well-argued proposal, which situates the ambiguity at the indefinite. So he says an indefinite has a weak or strong interpretation, or at least some indefinites have weak and strong interpretations. The weak interpretation, it just introduces a discourse referent and predicates the property that it combines with over the discourse referent. But under strong interpretation, additionally, it maximizes the set of possible witnesses associated with that discourse referent. And now, given this ambiguity, we can, if we just import this into our framework, we get, and we assume that the same ambiguity between weak and strong readings holds for WH phrases. Then with the weak interpretation, we get non-exhaustive, as we've already seen. And with the strong interpretation, we get exhaustive readings. So for instance, who strong is a vegetarian? We introduce a discourse referent. We say that the discourse referent is vegetarian. Then we maximize witnesses with respect to the world component of the possibilities that we're considering. And then we raise the issue, what's the value of U? And then we get only these three alternatives. So only A with A assigned to U, only B with B, B, A and B with A, B assigned to U, and only B. Okay, so to conclude, we are pursuing, I mean, this is a work in progress, but we're working on this framework that integrates dynamic and inquisitive semantics in order to investigate these interactions between referential indeterminacy and inquisitiveness or question alternatives. Bringing those together, we can start investigating and capturing, we've now captured at least the basic cases of anaphora involving WH antecedents. There's a promising viewpoint on intervention effects that might have to do with failure of dynamic binding. I find this a very interesting and surprising result that exhaustive and non-exhaustive question readings can be connected or reduced to, in a way, to strong and weak readings of indefinites that also play a role in Doki anaphora. And more generally, I think this is, as I started out, this is a case study where we see that it's very interesting to bring two types of alternatives into focus at once and study their interaction. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Floris, for sharing this fascinating new work with us. We do have about a quarter of an hour for questions. If you have a question, please put Q into the chat so that we can call on you in the order of appearance. So I see Stefan was the first question.
Thank you. I have to lower my hand too, sorry. Yeah, that was great. Thank you very much. So my question is about your example 49. And this is just one example of a bunch. I mean, this comes up in the earlier examples as well. This is the last time where I noticed this. WH questions like this are basically interpreted, as if I understood this correctly, are interpreted exactly like someone has a bike that I could borrow for 15 minutes. Who is it?
Yeah.
Is that right, basically? Because so you're sort of splitting it up into this existential assertion plus then the request for the witness.
Yeah.
So I have to. So my question is about the first part, the existential assertion.
Yeah.
That is usually treated as a presupposition or maybe even something weaker in case of questions. I mean, 49 is a perfect example because it doesn't even presuppose, I think, that someone has a bike that I could borrow for 15 minutes, let alone assert that. Yeah. So I was wondering about that throughout, even things like who arrived, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, yes. Okay. So
yeah. I see definitely your point. Very good point. And the thing that this connects to is this. So I said here that this interrogative type, I said, we simplify here a bit. We say that interrogativeness is just about ensuring inquisitiveness.
Yeah.
And in WH questions, that means that it doesn't do anything basically, because at the FOCB level, we have our alternative. So who has a bike that I could borrow? A has a bike, B has a bike, C has a bike. But I mentioned, so there is more to say, in particular about presuppositions.
I remember you saying that. Yes, I thought you might get back to this.
So this is it. So here, I think that interrogativeness, at least in English, these two things might come apart, but interrogativeness in English, I think, has two core roles to play. So the interrogative type clause marker, it's ensuring inquisitiveness, but also ensuring non-informativeness.
Mm-hmm. And
ensuring non-informativeness can be, one way of doing it is presupposing all the informative content of its sister, say. So if FOCB is informative, as it is in this case, then type had, well, it ensures inquisitiveness, and then it says whatever informative content is derived here, that is already presupposed. It's only about the issue. That's the, so it ensures inquisitiveness, and then it says it's only about the issue and not about the information here. So then you get for the question that we saw, you get an existential presupposition that there is somebody who has a bike that I could borrow. But so that's one thing. Another thing is that we think that WH elements are actually or can actually be a bit different from indefinites. So here they're treated exactly the same, right? So they introduce a discourse reference and apply the property that they combine with to the discourse reference. But what we would like to pursue, so we are, this is just an idea at this point, but what we would like to pursue is that WH elements can be extremely indeterminate, referentially indeterminate. So indefinites just don't determine the value of the discourse referent, whereas WH elements, at least some of them, can also leave it open whether there is a value at all. And so we have to find a way to, yeah.
That is sort of, that reminds me of this, in the very old original Hamblin writings, you get this residual answer kind of thing, which is what you want to treat that as a possible answer to the question, basically. Is that sort of the idea? Yeah.
That indeed, that so one possible answer then becomes there is no value. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that would be that's the idea that so, and this is I'm saying all the time that this is perhaps only true for certain WH elements. So I think for which, for instance, I don't think that holds, but for who, yeah, I mean, it is a controversial issue with to what extent who questions have an existential presupposition or don't, or allow both types of readings. As far as the evidence that I've seen so far, and maybe I haven't seen everything, but and I'm interested also on in Yael's thoughts in particular on this issue. But I think for who both interpretations are possible.
Well, you have things like who wants ice cream or that sort of thing, right?
Yeah. So definitely the non-presuppositional reading is possible, and whether we should treat that presuppositional reading as being possible or just somehow following from world knowledge, contextual knowledge or expectations. Perhaps it's only that. So definitely the non-presuppositional possible, and that would, so then what I said here about ensuring non-informativeness is not sufficient. We would really have to say that elements like who are extremely indeterminate in allowing for no possible value at all.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's good. That answers my question.